That we're looking at Acts chapter 21, and we're going to finish the lesson we started last week about that I titled The Humble Apostle. The Humble Apostle. In Acts chapter 21, verse 17, the Bible says, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them." So we began talking about this and talked about how Paul went up to Jerusalem with the friends from Caesarea and was received gladly. Of course, he had company, we might say, with him, several men from different churches across Macedonia and Achaia, even churches in Asia. The province, the Roman province of Asia, were with him, and they brought that offering, and this was an offering to show their concern for these Jewish Christians. It would be a lot of different reasons why that would be an encouragement, but it would show their unity, and Paul came to Jerusalem at this time, most likely. Big reason was that he wanted to be able to preach the gospel to the Jews that were there. It was going to be the Feast of Pentecost, and thousands of Jews would be there, unbelieving Jews. And as we read, there's thousands and thousands of believing Jews also. So we saw that, last week we saw that in verse 18, the day following, Paul went in with them. So we saw how he came here. He's the one that maybe we might call the mastermind behind getting this offering all together. But when it comes time to give the offering to the believers in Jerusalem, the scripture says that he went with them. They took the offering in there. It's kind of like he said, you guys did this. You get the whatever honor or appreciation or thanks that would come from doing it. And Paul went with them. And then Paul begins to then they asked Paul, the elders, the leadership of the church that was there, asked Paul they asked him about things that had been happening in his ministry, and he goes one by one, the word particularly meaning one by one, and talks about how God had worked through his ministry. God had accomplished many things through the work that Paul had done. And then in 20 and 21, the elders and James, when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe. And that word thousands is myriads, which means like 10,000. And so they said, how many tens of thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they're all zealots or zealous of the law. And we might put the word and they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. And that's the word apostasy, to apostatize from Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. So they had been informed. And that word, I think I mentioned last word, the word informed has the idea of a catechism that they had, and if you remember, if you ever had a catechism, it's very repetitious. You hear it and you hear it again and you hear it again. So these people had been hearing things about Paul. They'd been hearing it over and over and over and over again. You know what's the, it's ascribed to a lot of different people. I think it's ascribed to Abraham Lincoln, you could say. But if you say a falsehood enough times, people are going to believe it. So these people, they had heard things about Paul that was not true. We talked about how we know it's not true, that Jews ought not circumcise their children is not true. Paul took Timothy, who was only half Jew, and had him circumcised, and that Jews should not follow the customs is not true. Paul himself followed customs from in different areas and different of the customs. So these things were not true, but they had heard it, and they had heard it, and they had heard it. And they, even if you hear things enough times, even if you think there's no way that can be true, if you hear it 50, 60 times, it's still there in your head. You're wondering, oh, there he is. I wonder about those rumors. It sure doesn't seem like they'd be true, but I wonder. And so the Jews, the many thousands of Jews that were there, which believe, and this is an important thing to recognize, had been informed of these things. And so then in verse 22, the church there, the leadership of the church says, what should we do? What is it therefore? It's kind of like the phrase, what should we do? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. And then they give this, they say, how about we do this? And they don't really say, how about we do this? They say, do this that we say unto you. We have this, I'm in verse 23 now. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. So now these are the elders, the pastors of the church in Jerusalem are saying, do this, we've got these men, do this, join in with them in this ceremony. And they say, we want you to do this so that what? So that all may know those things. Now who would the all be that they are referring to? Ra, way back in the back. The Jews? Okay. Chris, what's that?
All the other churches.
All the other churches. Okay. Anyone else want to proffer an answer? I would say, slightly different, what's that? Gentiles? I don't think Gentiles. So, but who, right before this, what do they say? They say, you see how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they've heard these things. So this is all part of the same paragraph. We have these Jews, these believing Jews that have heard this about you. You do this so that the all would be all the believing Jews. The church is asking him to do this so that the Jews that are believers would know that what they've heard about him is nothing. Okay, that's the way we should understand this. You might have a Bible and that has just verses and you don't see the connection. This is a paragraph from verse 18 all the way to verse 26 is one, it's all connected together. So when they say, do this so that all know, that all is the people that they've been talking about in this same paragraph. And they've said, there's these many tens of thousands of Jews that believe. They're believers, but they're still zealous of the law. They've heard this. They've been told over and over and over again these things about you. They're going to come together. They're going to want to talk to you. They're going to want to see you. Here's what you need to do. Do this so that who? So that so that they all will know that this is nothing. I think it's important to recognize that. Because, and I'll just tell you why. There are a lot of people that look at this and say Paul was doing something bad, that he was compromising. Here he had told the Galatians that, the law is nothing and whatever, and now he's pulling back on his word and he's going along with the law, and see, it didn't even help him, because what happened in verse 27? They saw him in the temple. They stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, and he was arrested. Here he went through all this stuff. He compromised his convictions, and he was arrested. Anyway, it didn't help one bit. That's not true, okay? That's not recognizing what Scripture says. The people that arrested him, the people that stirred up everybody, they weren't Christians. Okay? They weren't Jews that were believers. The Bible doesn't tell us whether the Jews that were believers, we should assume the leadership of the church thought that was a good idea. Paul also happens to be an apostle, thought that was a good idea, followed through with it, and that we should assume that the believers recognized that Paul wasn't teaching these things, and this was a positive thing to do in this situation. God had determined that Paul would give his testimony to governors and emperors, and he used this time to get Paul into prison. But anyway, so I might be belaboring the point, but I just want us to see the Scriptures connected together. The all there is not everyone in the whole world. It's the all of the people that were already brought up in this paragraph. So, do this, they say. So, what do they ask him to do? We have 4 men with a vow on their head. Is that what is? There's only 2 times in the New Testament, I was looking this morning, that the word vow is used, and one is in Acts 18, when the Bible tells us that Paul took a vow, and the other is here. So what vow is this? Well, we look at how it's described. It says, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charge with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know. So there's a certain vow in the Old Testament that involves the shaving of the head. And that we can learn about in Numbers chapter 6. I'd like us to turn to Numbers chapter 6. Let's see. Numbers chapter 6. The Bible says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and saying to them, when either man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazarite, to separate themselves unto the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink, and shall drink no vinegar of wine or vinegar of strong drink, neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dried. All the days of his separation shall he eat nothing that is made of the vine tree, from the kernels even to the husk. All the days of the vow of his separation there shall no razor come upon his head, until the days be fulfilled, in the which he separates himself unto the Lord. He shall be holy, and shall let the locks of his hair, of the hair of his head grow. All the days that he separates himself unto the Lord, he shall come at no dead body. He shall not make himself unclean for his father, or for his mother, for his brother, or for his sister when they die, because the consecration of his God is upon his head. All the days of his separation he is holy unto the Lord, and if any man die very suddenly by him, and he has defiled the head of his consecration, then he shall shave his head in the day of his cleansing. There we have a shaving of the head. On the 7th day shall he shave it. And on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtles and 2 young pigeons to the priest, to the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And the priest shall offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, and make an atonement for him, for that he sinned by the dead, and shall hallow his head that same day. And he shall consecrate unto the Lord the day of his separation, and shall bring a lamb of the first year for a trespass offering. But the days that were before shall be lost, because of his separation was defiled. And this is the law of the Nazarite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall offer his offering unto the Lord, one he-lamb of the first year without blemish for a burnt offering, and one ewe-lamb of the first year without blemish for a sin offering, and one lamb without blemish for peace offerings, and a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mingled with oil, and wafers of unleavened bread anointed with oil, and their meat offering, and their drink offerings. And the priest shall bring them before the Lord, and shall offer his sin offering and his burnt offering, and he shall offer the ram for his sacrifice of peace offerings unto the Lord, with the basket of unleavened bread. The priest shall offer also his meat offering and his drink offering. And the Nazarite shall shave his head of his separation at the door of the tabernacle congregation, and shall take the hair of the head of his separation and put it in the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings. And the priest shall take the seethed shoulder of the ram and one unleavened cake out of the basket, and one unleavened wafer, and shall put them upon the hands of the Nazarite after the hair of his separation is shaven. And the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. This is holy for the priest, with the wave breast and heave shoulder, and after that the Nazarite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazarite who is vowed, and of his offering unto the Lord for his separation, besides that his hand shall get, according to the vow which he vowed, so he must do after the law of his separation. Now that was kind of a longer passage. We have described this kind of fairly intricate or detailed ritual that would take place. But part of the ritual that concludes the vow of a Nazarite is the shaving of the head and taking the hair and putting it in the fire under the altar of sacrifice. So these men, going back to Acts, there were 4 men in the church at Jerusalem that had taken upon them the vow of a Nazarite. Now, one thing, we don't have the time to go all into it, we spent time there. A Nazarite vow was a voluntary vow. Now, there were a few people that God said they were a Nazarite. You remember Samson, right? So Samson didn't have any choice in the matter. Anyone remember anyone else? Sorry? Samuel, yes. Samuel, his mom promised that he would be a Nazarite. And seems like there was another one, John the Baptist, I believe. Okay, but those are exceptions to what was normal. They were born as a Nazarite, and they had to follow this rule all the days of their life. But normally, someone would, we don't know why, any particular individual, what were the specific reasons why a particular individual would take a vow on them, but they would say, I'm going to separate myself unto the Lord and take on myself the vow of a Nazarite. So that would happen, and they would have, history tells us either 30 days or 60 days or 90 days was the normal length of time that they would say, I'm going to do this for. And so then during that time of the Nazarite vow, these stipulations that the scriptures put on them, they would follow. They wouldn't eat, drink anything that came from a vine. They wouldn't touch anything that was dead. And they wouldn't cut their hair. And then at the end of that, they would cut their hair, burn it under the offering, and then they could drink the fruit of the, grapes and eat grapes and drink the fruit of the vine. But did you notice how many offerings were part of this ceremony that concluded the time of a Nazarite vow? There was what was it? Was it? A he-lamb, a ewe-lamb, a lamb. There was a little section there in the middle that if for some reason somebody died right next to him during the middle of this time, there was a special ceremony. But let's just say that somebody had a successful Nazarite vow and nobody died near them during the time of they wouldn't have that two turtle doves part of it. That was just saying what should happen if that situation arose. But they come to the end and they have several offerings. And it's interesting. I don't know. I think because I'm thinking about this and other things, my lesson in Bible Club was about sacrifice, having joy in sacrifice. And I was thinking about these sacrifices. So, the Bible, we have to be careful that the Bible gets to be just like that thing that we read about stuff that happened a long time ago. And it applies to what we're talking about here. When when it came time to fulfill the obligations at the end of a Nazarite vow, it's not like the guy showed up at the temple and said, okay, I'm here to finish up my Nazarite vow. Where's the temple animals? He brought his animals. Okay, he got himself a he lamb and a ewe lamb and a lamb and all the oil and the meal, and that's the word that goes. That's the way we should understand the word meat. Is the flour and all of that kind of stuff. He brought all that stuff. Okay? Now, a lamb, even though they're not big, you take the whole lamb, that's a lot. There's wool there if they're a good producing lamb. If they're not, there's food there, there's meat there, and more than one meal. So they're bringing all of that. That wasn't just $5 in the offering plate, right? This is an offering. It was a sacrifice. It was a sacrifice for the person to bring their sacrifice. It involved cost. They had to give things up to bring this sacrifice to finish this out. So back into Acts, the elders say to Paul, we have these 4 guys who have taken on them the vow, and that it's clear they're talking about a Nazarite vow, and so them take and purify thyself with them. Now, it seems like that Paul is not taking this vow on himself. The law at that time, or tradition, or whatever, allowed for someone to join themselves to a Nazarite, kind of as a point of charity or identification. Actually, there's a story in ancient history about one of the Herods who came along and joined with some Nazarites to kind of, I think it was probably more of a political move to show connection to the Jewish people. But it was allowed. So what somebody could do, these men, they might have been too poor to pay for their offerings, to bring their offerings. It might not have been. But what the church leaders asked Paul to do is to come along with them, and in order to do that, he had to purify himself. He'd been all over the world. So he had to go to the temple and begin a 7-day ritual. It wasn't every day, but he would go to the temple and say to the priest, I'm presenting myself for purification. I am going to, we might say, sponsor these men who are finishing their Nazarite vow. And in order for him to participate in the conclusion of that, he had to be pure. He had to be ritually cleansed. So he would go there the first day, he'd go back the 3rd day, and then on the 7th day, he would be cleansed, and those guys, of course, were already in 30 days or 60 days of this thing, and then they would finish out the sacrifice, the Nazarite vow. So they're saying, purify thyself with them, so join with them in this ritual, in this ceremony. And remember, this is a voluntary ceremony. This was not an offering that these guys were participating in for the atonement of their sins, for anything like that. It was a voluntary offering for to show some type of a devotion to the Lord. And then it says, and be at charges with them. That phrase has to do with the money. So basically they said, Paul, we think you ought to pay you ought to provide the sacrifices for these men to finish their Nazirite vow. Because it might be one thing to go through a ritual, but if you're putting your money into it, that shows a little more into it. And how many is he? There's like 4 animals, maybe. There's a whole bunch of stuff for each one. And how many of them are there? There's 4 of them. So Paul has to take his money. Obviously, he didn't carry these. He had to take his money, go and buy all the sacrifices to conclude the Nazirite vow times 4. So that's going to be a lot of money, and provide those for these men to finish their Nazirite vow. You can hopefully see that for Paul to agree to this, it wasn't like it was just some flippant thing that he was like, oh yeah, I'll do that. If I got to do that to please those people, this was serious. This is quite an obligation. It would prove to people that he wasn't out there saying, oh, the customs of Israel, you don't need to do any of those things. You don't need to worry about, the sign of circumcision for your children, all of that stuff. That's nothing. This, following through with this, would do what the leaders of the church there thought it could do. So pay their charges. Now, this is also, we might say, this is something that Paul had done before. In Acts 18, I mentioned that when we were starting. In Acts 18:18, and Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then he's in Corinth, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea. He'd cut his hair there, for he had a vow. So he was heading to Jerusalem. Now this seems a little different than what we read in Numbers, but apparently when once they were dispersed all over the world, if a Jew had taken a vow, he would shave his head at a certain time, but he would save that hair to bring it to the temple so he could conclude the ritual of a Nazirite vow. And it seems like that's what Paul is doing here. He had shorn his head, he had cut his hair, and it doesn't say he put it in a bag or whatever, but he's also heading to Jerusalem because he had done that. So Paul has taken part in a Nazirite vow before. So the leaders of the church say, Paul, take part in this, join with these men, be pure, go to the temple, be purified with them so that you can join with them and offer, and then provide the sacrifices for them so they can finish up this Nazirite vow. And by this, the Jews that will believe will know that the things they've heard of you are not true, are nothing. And then they say in verse 25, as touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing. So they're making it clear, we're not changing anything that we believe. In chapter 15, we wrote, and we could go there, verses 23 through 29, they wrote to the Gentile believers that they didn't need to observe anything except for the things mentioned there. Things offered to idols, blood, strangled, and from fornication. That's not any different than what they said before. So we're not changing what the Gentiles believe. This is just, we're asking you to do this so that the Jews that believe can know that what they've been catechized, what they've been told over and over again about you is not true. And so then we see in verse 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple. So he went the next day to begin this process, this 7-day process, to signify the accomplishment of the days. So he went there. The wording there, he went there to say, I'm going to accomplish the days of purification, and then I'm going to be a sponsor or whatever with these men who are finishing their vow. So to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. So he's going to bring the offering for every one of them. And it's just so, and if you say, well, how do you know it means that he was doing that because of the 7 days? Well, the next verse, which is the next paragraph, says, and when the 7 days were almost ended. So we know he was going there the first day, and then 7 days later he was going to go into the temple. And when the 7 days were almost ended, what happens in the next paragraph begins. So we see here that Paul, as we kind of mentioned last week, and now we have a little more detail into how he went about submitting himself to church authority. He did. He submitted himself to church authority, and actually it was another church's authority. He was sent out from the church at Antioch. He was from there. That's why he left from there. He came back to there. He reported to them what the Lord had done after the first journey. After the second journey, he went up to Antioch and then went out from there for his third journey. And I think very much so, he was intending to go up there after he had done this here in Jerusalem. But then he was arrested. So he's from the church in Antioch, and he's an apostle. He has, by this time, written things and talked about how he has authority as an apostle and all of these things. But here, he listens to what these elders, unnamed elders, pastors of the church at Jerusalem, tell him, we think you should do this. And he does it. He surely, well, of course that was Peter, but he didn't think he had a chair that he could speak from, and this whatever he says is true, and no one should tell him what to do. He wasn't full of pride or thought more of his position. It was, and we should remember, it was his practice to submit himself to other people's what we might call hang-ups. I couldn't think of a better word right now. But in 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 23, he says, to the Jews I became as a Jew, to those outside the law or without a law, I became as without a law. Of course, not without a law to God, but, and he just mentions all these different groups of people that he was going to do what he could within the bounds of what God expected so that he could meet them, so that he could help them in their to come to Christ or as Christians. And so what the church asked him to do was not outside the bounds of what he had already done, and they were a church. They had the authority to do it. And Paul shows his humility. He lets the churches present their offering to him. He talks about how God did the work throughout the world of his ministry, and he submits himself to these elders' request and the pastor's request, and this is just again, this is kind of a repeat, but it should be a help to us. We wherever we are, we get thinking that we're something, that we've accomplished this, so now we can tell other people what to do, and there's probably a place, a time when we should tell other people what to do. But we should not ever think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. We should, as Philippians tells us, take upon us the mind of Christ. We ought to think of the other better than ourselves. All of these things are truths, principles that we should live by, and that will help us to have a happy and a joyful Christian life. Let's pray, Father.